This is going to be a summary of World War II. You can call it an overview if you want. I've got the years of the war, and the end of the war is pretty clear, 1945, but the beginning of the war, a lot less clear. We'll discuss when the war actually began. Let's start with the sides, the alliances. We've got the Allied powers and the Axis powers. And it looks like there's only a few countries that were involved. There was actually a lot more countries involved. As you can see here on this map, very few countries actually stayed neutral. But these are what are called the belligerent warring powers. The Allied powers include Great Britain, France, Soviet Union, and eventually the United States. And the Axis powers are Germany and Italy, and also Japan. Now, World War II begins a lot as the anxiety and pressure of the Great Depression spread around the world throughout the 1930s. And because a lot of people in a lot of countries were so desperate because of the Great Depression, it allowed for certain rulers to rise up in certain countries. In Italy, Benito Mussolini was able to rise to power under the Italian Social Republic war flag you see there. And we also saw in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin rising to power in 1922 with the Soviet Union. We see Adolf Hitler rise to power in Germany in 1933. And we see basically these fascist leaders. These are political systems that are marked by strong central authority, meaning those leaders have all of the power, and they place the power or the authority of the nation above the individual rights and freedoms of the people. They also might call it a totalitarian government, a governing system in which the ruling elite, the people in charge, hold all the power, they control all parts of society, and they often use terror. And so because people were so desperate, they allowed these types of leaders to rise to power in their countries. One more example is Japan, where they didn't really have a totalitarian government. They did have a prime minister, that was Hideki Tojo, and they also had an emperor, who is Emperor Hirohito. And we'll begin with Japan. In 1931, Japan was working to expand its territory across the Sea of Japan, and from Japan over into Korea. They invaded through Manchuria and parts of China, through Beijing, and they exacted a lot of slaughter along the way. So Japan was being very belligerent there through China. We saw Italy invade East Africa in 1935, and you can see Italy is here. There's parts of East Africa, North and East Africa, where Italy had begun to invade. And of course, we saw Germany invade the Rhineland, which is here in 1936, and the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia, and also invading Austria. And throughout all of that, we don't know if we want to say that that is the beginning of the war, or if we just want to say that was some of the actions that led up to the beginning of the war. But we certainly know that when Germany invaded into Poland, that is when a few other countries, including Great Britain and France, declared war on Germany. And so you might say that is when World War II actually began. Now let's talk about the United States. The United States was attempting to stay neutral. That means they were not supporting either side of this war. At least they weren't involved in fighting. But it was clear who they were supporting when Franklin Roosevelt used the Lend-Lease Act. This is a way that he was able to either lend, so loan or borrow supplies, or lease them, kind of like renting them, to their allies. The United States supplied over $50 billion in aid to these allied nations, especially Great Britain, France, Soviet Union, and China. And the way that Roosevelt looked at this was any country whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States will receive help from the United States. Of course, that did not include Germany, Italy, or Japan. So it was clear which side the United States was on, and then it was even more crystal clear whose side they were on when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. This is when the United States then declares war on Japan. And you see Roosevelt here in front of Congress asking Congress for a declaration of war. They quickly give it to him, and the United States enters the war on the side of the Allies. So we now again have the Axis powers, which are Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allies, which are United States, Great Britain, Soviet Union, and France. And I say sort of because France is invaded by Germany. France falls, and they are no longer necessarily one of the warring powers. One other character here, Winston Churchill, is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And as we saw Germany continue to expand across Europe, like we see here, Winston Churchill realizes that his country is really the only ally left in Europe that is able to stop Germany. And now that Franklin Roosevelt and the United States are involved in the war, the two of them, Churchill and Roosevelt, sort of form a bond or a friendship over a common enemy, as they see, again, the Nazis have taken control of most of Europe. So here is the island of Great Britain. Okay, so now we'll discuss the D-Day invasion. Quickly, the D-Day invasion is what Churchill and Roosevelt figured is how they could actually stop the Nazis, by invading into northern France, getting a foothold or a toehold in northern France, and being able to use that to fight through Europe into Germany. So the D-Day invasion is also known as Operation Overlord, and it was a massive invasion that included over 1 million troops invading Normandy Beach, this region of northern France, again attempting to push Germany out of France. It is the largest land, sea, and air combined, land, sea, and air operation in military history. You can see here as they're traveling across the English Channel, invading the northern part of France, getting that toehold, and using it to propel themselves through France and into Germany. Dwight Eisenhower was the supreme commander of the Allied forces, and he led the Allies valiantly. A couple of quick images of the D-Day invasion. And that image right there, I think, shows you quite a bit. Okay, we also discussed the Holocaust, the sad story of persecution, where the Nazis were attempting to slaughter an entire group of people, the Jews, along with many other people. 6 million Jews were killed, and maybe up to 13 million or so people were actually killed during the Holocaust. On April 12th, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, suffered a massive brain hemorrhage. He had a stroke, and he had some other physical ailments and issues already, and as a result of that massive brain hemorrhage, Roosevelt dies. On April 12th, 1945, the war is not over yet, but then just 18 days later, the United States and the Soviet Union closed in on Berlin, Germany, and Adolf Hitler, rather than facing the consequences of his actions, he decided to commit suicide in a bunker at his Berlin headquarters. Once that happens, Germany then surrenders, and on May 1st, we see people all over the world celebrate, and we see Americans in New York celebrate in this image here. Over here on May 5th, we're seeing prisoners in the Dachau prison camp, or the Dachau concentration camp, which was part of the Holocaust. We see the prisoners celebrating the arrival of American soldiers, and then on May 7th, Germany officially surrenders unconditionally to the Allies. And May 8th then is known as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. We're going to see a few images of celebrations here around the world. We see crowds gathering in Great Britain, celebrating in London at Trafalgar Square. We see Winston Churchill here, the Prime Minister, waving to the crowds gathered in Whitehall, again on VE Day. This is a cool image of Prime Minister Churchill, the King and the Queen of England, and their 2 daughters. And right over here, this is Princess Margaret, and this is Princess Elizabeth, who Princess Elizabeth served actually in World War II for the British Army in what is called the Women's Auxiliary Territory Service. It's basically, the ATS is basically providing key support for the war. Its members served as like anti-aircraft gunners and radio operators, mechanics and drivers, and she was royalty actually serving in the war. You might recognize Princess Elizabeth because she goes on to become Queen Elizabeth, and she is still the reigning monarch of Great Britain. She is still the Queen of England. This is an image of crowds at the Champs-Élysées. On top of this right here is the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And one more image of New Yorkers cheering upon hearing that Germany has unconditionally surrendered. That's the end of part 1. We'll go to part 2 in a second. Make sure that you click on part 2 here.